Can you tell us a little bit about what your organization, Giving Voice to Values, is up to in recent months?
Sure. Thanks a lot. And thank you all for being here. I found your opening comments really touching. And I have to say, I've just got back, Arye knows this, I just got back late last night from Europe, where I spent the week during all of the various responses to the US election. Don't worry, I did vote. I was thinking before I left, gee, it's too bad that this webinar is on Sunday. I'll be jet lagged, I'll be tired. I was feeling a little like, oh, I made the wrong choice to schedule it then. And then actually Thursday, Friday, and then even more yesterday, I was thinking, oh, I'm so looking forward to this conversation because I felt like I needed it. So I want to thank you all for coming and being here. In terms of what's going on with Giving Voice to Values these days, I know some of you already are quite familiar with it, and Arye did a really nice sort of introduction. But what I spend all my time doing is traveling around internationally. I'm traveling almost every week, sharing Giving Voice to Values. Initially, it was always with business schools because it was designed as a curriculum for business education. But increasingly now, I'm also meeting with a lot of business companies and also other organizations. So, for example, to give you a taste, this week I was in Amsterdam spending the day with a group of business faculty at The View, which is the second largest and most well respected of the private universities there. And then on Friday, I was in Munich with a group of about 24 corporate executives from major German-based multinationals. And so those are the kinds of audiences. But then I've also been spending more time with I was in Australia a few weeks ago working with nurses and nursing education, particularly in the field of palliative care. And I've started doing some work with law school professors. I worked with the police force in the state of Queensland in Australia. I've been working with the US military on their leadership development. So the work has been expanding and growing. I guess having moved recently to the University of Virginia at Darden, the reason for that move, although I'm still based physically in Boston, is that I'm thinking I want to make sure there's a legacy for the GVV work. I mean, I believe in it. I think of it as an idea. That's why we make it available for free. I think no one owns ideas, and what I really want to do is make an impact. So I was looking for an institution that would be committed enough to the ideas to keep it going even when I'm not doing the work that I do now. And I think I've found that in the Darden School of Business. They're very excited. They're a school that's been known for years for their commitment to integrating values-driven leadership into their business program. And they see GVV as kind of business ethics 2.0. You get beyond the cognitive and you get to the action orientation of it. So that's a lot of what I've been doing. So I'll stop there.
So thanks, Mary. Can you make it a little more concrete for us? Can you give us an example? Like you go around to all these places, to universities, businesses. Give us an example the past week of the kind of issue that you were working on and why people wanted you there.
Yeah, I think this past week was probably, it was fine, but it was more at the early stages. So maybe I'll give you an example of some work I did a few months ago that I think had gone a little further. It might be a more interesting story because it's further along. I was approached by the major corporation, multinational. They have been doing a lot of work around leadership and values for their senior executives. But they realized that you really need to bring this down into the whole organization. And one of their leadership development people had heard me speak at Harvard Business School. So they thought, gee, maybe Giving Voice to Values, or GVV as I call it, might be a useful approach. And the strategy that they've adopted is they wanted to invite the managing director, the head of one of their regional or country offices, to pilot this approach. So they issued the invitation. And the senior executive who put up his hand was the head of the Nigeria office. And so last year they invited me to come out and spend a week in Lagos and to meet with a lot of the executives, to do interviews and focus groups to try and understand what their conflicts were, what their challenges were in the business there, which of course are even greater now due to the price of oil and some of the impact that's had on the economy there. And then after doing that reconnaissance, we went back, we sort of customized the GVV curriculum. We created cases that were specific to their situations. And then we invited all of the senior management team, which is about a dozen people, and a group of about 35 hand-picked middle managers to go through the online modules as preparation for my going back down and spending a couple days with them a few months later, 4 or 5 months later, where we did a train the trainer sort of session. The idea was that we were getting all the managers familiar with the Giving Voice to Values approach, and then those middle manager change champions have now delivered the training that we designed to the rest of the organization. They're now following up on that by having a communication strategy where they're inviting people on a regular basis to share examples of times when they've encountered values conflicts and either have found an effective way to voice and act on their values so that people can learn from that, or are asking for input and sort of collecting and sharing those stories. The other thing they did that I'll just mention and I'll stop again is that somebody mentioned an emphasis on listening, which has become, I think, really important, especially when I work with GVV and I end up working with the senior leaders too. A lot of what I say to them is, you know, you just as any employee wants to practice and rehearse how to voice their values effectively, you need to practice and rehearse how to hear it when they bring it to you, because it's never a welcome message. It's always time-consuming, often expensive. It's usually bad news in some way, often delivered with some emotion. And so when I was in Nigeria, we put the senior leadership team in the same room with the middle managers. And after we introduced GVV method to them, and we gave them scenarios to work on, we asked all the middle managers to talk to each other about how could they raise these issues effectively within the organization. But we asked the senior leaders to talk to each other about how could a middle manager bring this issue to me in a way that would make it easier for me to respond effectively. So they were answering different questions about the same scenario. One was about, you know, delivering, one was about reflecting on how can I hear it. And then when they came back to talk together, there was a kind of natural social contracting that kind of emerged. And they created what they called the GVV deal, which was a signed commitment on the senior leadership team saying, if you can raise these issues with us in these ways, we will commit to listen. And the middle manager saying, you know, if you will listen, we will commit to raise issues in these ways. And so there's a kind of, you know, a two-way conversation going on. So that's kind of an example. I could give you others, but I'll stop.
Yeah. You know, I just noticed we had a question from Debbie, which I think is an interesting question, is can you give a concrete example of the kinds of issues that are raised? You know, what is it, you know, in an example that people might be disagreeing about?
Yeah. So one of the ideas, it's a great question. One of the ideas behind GVV is that we're focusing, you know, usually people say if you're going to talk about ethics and values, don't focus on the clear-cut, right, wrong, you know, so-called black and white issues. Focus on the gray issues that are trickier, the ethical dilemmas. I actually have changed my mind about that because I've decided that the gray issues, and we will get to this because it relates to some of the current political scene, but the gray issues are issues where often reasonable people of goodwill can legitimately disagree. That's why they're gray. But nevertheless, there are a lot of issues where most of us would agree it's not right, it's not appropriate, it's illegal, it's fraudulent, it's abusive, whatever. But nevertheless, many of us don't think it's possible to act effectively, or we make other decisions about it. And so since Giving Voice to Values is about focusing on action planning and scripting and rehearsing, we actually will start with the so-called clear-cut issues because we want people to focus on action. And if we only focus on the dilemmas, we never get to action and we just go around and around on the dilemma. Ironically, if you get better at acting on these and scripting and talking about these clear-cut issues, it actually, I think, makes people better at dealing with the gray issues too. But for pedagogical purposes, we've reversed the sequence. So an example is in the so-called clear-cut issues. In business, for example, there are often situations where people are pressured to do what they call cooking the books, tampering with the accounting and the reporting, whether it's of financial results, whether it's of customer numbers, whether it's a number of clicks on a website, lots of ways they count these things. And there are all kinds of billable hours, inflating your billable hours. There are lots of ways in business where people will sort of manipulate the numbers they're reporting on a whole raft of topics. And it's pretty clearly wrong. It's often against the law. It's sometimes against accounting standards. Sometimes it's just against corporate policy. And it certainly isn't, it doesn't have integrity. But there are lots of reasons why it happens, and there's lots of rationalizations for it. And so that would be the kind of example that and so people are often pressured to do it. They know that it's probably not appropriate, but they really don't know how to say no, especially if it's their boss who's asking them to do it. In Nigeria, I'll give you an example. There was one of the managers who was taking me around on my first visit to Lagos. She was sort of my host while I was there. Wonderful woman, really impressive. And she was, sitting in on all of the interviews and all of the focus groups. And at the last day of my visit, I had about an hour before I was going to the airport. And she said, "Could I have this hour?" And I said, "Sure." So we sat down and she said, "Well, I've been listening to you all week, and there's a number of issues that have come up with me recently in my job, and I know they're wrong, and I've just basically punted. I haven't known how to deal with them, even though I know I should be doing something. Can we rehearse and script together?" So I said, "Sure." So she told me this story about how there's a corporate policy at Unilever, which comes from the top, that whatever kind of waste product you have is not supposed to be put into the general landfill. It's supposed to be disposed of in an environmentally responsible way. And she said that, but this was made at corporate in the UK. And she said, here in Nigeria, there's actually a law, that says that you have to use the government contractors to dispose of your waste. Now, there's various opportunities for corruption there, of course. And it turns out that the government contractors deposit the waste in the landfill. So she said when she was doing a contract with a third-party vendor who was going to be doing some of their waste disposal, he said, "Well, I have the option here to disobey the law in order to comply with your corporate policies, or to obey the law and not comply with your corporate policies. I'm stuck between a rock and a hard place. How do I deal with this?" And she basically said, she just kind of said, "Just sign it," and she knew that wasn't right. She knew she was basically, as a representative of the company, basically telling him to lie on this contract, right? And she didn't feel comfortable with it.
So how did your program address this situation?
So we talked together and just sort of started brainstorming about the scripting, the clear case. She knew what was right. So we talked about the fact that this was a situation where clearly the intent was good on all parties' sides, but the way the situation played out, it was encouraging people to be deceptive and to lie or break rules. So what we did is we talked about who she could raise this issue with effectively within Unilever, because she supported Unilever's environmental responsibility policies, but it looked like they needed to think a little bit more locally to figure out this may be more of an incremental process in a place like Nigeria where the law, they also are supposed to obey the local laws. So we basically scripted and talked about who she should speak with, how she could present it. And I was back a few months later and she reported that she had done so and that actually it had started a good conversation where they're trying to adapt the policy within the organization to not just say never mind about environmental responsibility, but to be a little bit more incremental, realistic, and committed to a locally sensitive application of the rule so that they can move toward their ultimate goal without putting people in the position where they're kind of requiring them to deceive somebody.
Okay. Per our conversation, Mary, a little before we got started today, I want to shift the focus now and try getting at this issue from another viewpoint, and that is, what about, the kinds of conversations that many of us may be having right now within local groups or local communities or even workplaces since the election and all of the upset that's triggered, in people in the U.S. and also around the world. Just a couple of local examples here. Wendy and I belong to a local community organization, and we were there a few nights ago, and there was a discussion. And the presenter was a Muslim leader who is a Republican, and people in the group who were Bernie Sanders supporters got very upset. How can you be a Muslim and a Republican at the same time? Don't you realize you voted for somebody? And it was very hard to keep the room under control. A more personal situation is Wendy and I were having a conversation recently with family members about what they were going to do about, President-elect Trump. And there was one member of the family who was just outraged at the whole situation and was outraged at the rest of us because we weren't angry enough about the situation, and it's very explosive. And so, I'm wondering how giving voice to values might, you were talking about very large, complex, multi-levels of management, big global organizations. Is there anything about this that applies to a group of people sitting in the same room, talking to each other during these times?
Yeah. So, obviously I couldn't help but think about this past week and actually over the last few months. And, at one level, I'm personally devastated by the results of the election. Was in Europe all week with people saying, what the heck are you guys doing? And in this position of, trying to explain the United States when I didn't understand what was going on. But I've actually also been trying to figure out, is there anything that I work on in organizations that could be useful? And I've come up with a couple ideas, and I'm offering them to you as exploration, right? Because I'm in the same boat as everyone else on this one, but they're the things I'm going to try. So I'll just share what I've been thinking about. The first thing I've been thinking about is not something that's necessarily a GVV idea. It's actually something I take from Buddhism, but I think it's something that's influenced me in GVV, which is that I've been trying to do this kind of in and out viewing of things, where I guess the short way people talk about it is think globally, act locally, but I've really been trying to think about putting this decision in a larger historical context, not as a way of abdicating any sense of urgency, but as a way of catching my breath so I can keep breathing and act in a more responsible and balanced way. I won't read it to you. I was thinking I might, but I think it will take too long. But if anyone's interested, just email me after this. The university I'm at, the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, the president there a couple weeks ago before the election, Teresa Sullivan, sent around an amazing email. UVA was founded by Thomas Jefferson, and she sent around this email, which was informed by the research of one of the historians there. And there's just a paragraph in this email where she describes the election between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams when Thomas Jefferson became president of the U.S. The language and the description of what was going on was eerily familiar with this horrible name calling, people being referred to as a, a bunch of witches. This kind of language they used back then, I guess. We don't usually use that now, but a bunch of, and talking about the kind of violence and murder and raping and pillaging that's going to go on if this election. I mean, it was really extreme and kind of shocked me, a lack of my own historical, sensibility. And Jefferson was, won and actually then brought the country together in many ways. So it's an interesting example. It's this example of taking the longer view, not so that you can escape and say it's all okay, because it isn't, but so that you can actually keep acting. Okay, so that's one thing that I'm trying to do, is to kind of go in and out in terms of that.
So you might encourage all of us to, as part of what we're doing, to take a longer view.
Yeah, not as a way not to act, but to understand that, people are strong, people are resilient, and we can learn from things. Another example I'll give is something that just happened to me this week in Amsterdam. Most of the faculty I was meeting with at this university feel the same way I do about the results of the election. But at the end of the day, there was a woman who came to see me, a faculty member there. She was Chinese by birth, but worked in Amsterdam at this university, clearly educated woman. And she started, she was a Trump supporter. And she basically started talking about all the reasons she was a Trump supporter. And, at first I was, thinking, well, this is really interesting. And I've had some conversations with Chinese friends, so I was interested in her perspective. She was misinformed on a few data points, but in general, a lot of what she was saying was very similar to what you would have heard from Trump supporters here in the US. She was reading the same stories, etc. And it was interesting to see my own reaction, because initially, I was very balanced and listening. I mean, after all, I was there on a consulting trip, and but as time went on, I was just horrified by the things she was saying, right? And I was trying to offer other facts, what I consider to be the fact, to help her see it in a different way. But I also realized I was getting pretty emotional, and it led me to recognize something. I'll just give one example. She was talking about some of Trump's language, sexist language, and some of the misogynistic behaviors that have been reported. And she said, and I quote, "All men talk that way," right? It's really not a big deal. So I was upset by this. But what was interesting is that I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, I mean, I'm a lesbian, and I'm often in situations with other gays who will feel like you have to do certain kinds of things, or you're being, are expressing internalized homophobia. There are times when I have made decisions about what I'm going to act on and what I'm not going to act on. I mean, I'm out in all my work situations, but there are times when I will understand, for example, the marriage. I'm married to my partner, but for years I was the president of a gay legal rights group, and we were always making decisions about whether it was the right time to push for that. Now, we were all very clearly committed to equal rights for the LGBTQ community. And I started thinking about it, perhaps from her perspective, she was making that same kind of equation. She was kind of, I mean, it's not how I see it, but I was trying to understand that perhaps she was thinking that all men talk this way, it's not what they mean, blah, blah, blah. And she was trying to think about what we really need at a deeper sense, which in her mind was all about economics. And she thought that as a businessman, he was going to help improve the economic conditions for other people. Yeah. So that was the other thing the second thing that I learned was this idea of understanding that what people say doesn't necessarily, my equation about what values it represents is not necessarily what it represents. And the last thing that I recognized was that.
And then, Mary, I want to make sure we leave time for people to speak.
Okay, I'll just give one more.
To wrap it up.
The last thing I'll say is that I think when you're talking to someone who disagrees with you, I think it's often, there's often a very natural tendency to see for the value that you're looking for. So there's a guy who wrote a book about race relations. He's rather conservative, actually, but a very thoughtful guy named Shelby Steele. And he talked about the phenomenon they call seeing for innocence, which he basically says is a way that often in America, he was talking about race relations, there's a way that we will, as white people, we will see for innocence. We'll find ways to see behaviors of other white people as innocent and not racist. I think that there's also a way that we can see for bigotry. And so I was thinking, you know, whenever I talk to someone who disagrees with me and I hear what they say, I find a way to interpret it as they are racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-Muslim, whatever the issue is, you know, climate deniers, whatever. And I was realizing that, you know, sometimes that's not what's driving them. It may end up actually having that impact, so there might be a reason to fight and fight against it, but it isn't necessarily what they are operating, where they're operating from. And I think that helps us get to the GVV principle of normalization, which is that if we go to the emotional level, we can't have this conversation. We need to normalize it and understand that political differences are human, natural, everyday, important, useful, and normalize them.
So can we summarize the 3 points that you made sort of very briefly? I want to be able to hold them in my head. The first is take the longer and bigger perspective.
We'll go in and out.
Okay.
Long and close, you know, go in and out. Don't just stay up there.
Okay, and the second is?
Let's see, the second one was when I was talking about, what was I talking about? I'm sorry. Was it the story about the Chinese woman and the Chinese faculty member?
Yeah.
Right.
So the second point is what?
Well, that I was recognizing that sometimes you can actually share a value, but be deciding strategically that at a certain point you need to focus on another value. So it's like my example of, you know,
okay, so you can share a value but focus on another one.
It doesn't mean that you're sexist or homophobic or whatever the issue is. You're making a strategic decision. You may not agree with it. But,
and the third one is?
And the third one is this idea of seeing for innocence. That
seeing for innocence. Or, yeah, okay, great.